I've worked for big publishers, including Sony. I've run some startup businesses in mobile technology. Some of those have been very successful where we've managed to sell those businesses. Some of those have not been successful where we've managed to close those businesses. I've worked for the government here in the Northwest for a number of years around helping small industries in the Northwest to export and also to become a bit more commercial. And currently I work for a company called Standfast Interactive, who are a game production investment fund. So we invest into games. So having been in the games industry for many, many years and having gone through equity investment through VCs and other routes, one of the key problems that we found in games is that very few people have been able to invest into a game as opposed to a company. And for a lot of games companies, they don't necessarily want to sell their businesses, they just want to make successful games. So we sit in an interesting space right now where we invest into a game and hopefully the games are successful, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that in a little bit. But it works very similar to a production fund for TV and film, if you're familiar with how that's funded. Again, I'll go into some details. So apologies if we're preaching to the converted, but just some stats. And I've pulled out some pretty high-level stats. There is another one we could throw in there, which is the Oculus Rift purchase, which happened a couple of days ago for $2 billion, that, again, I'll refer to in the end. Out of all of the stats here, I wanted to pull out two particular stats that, for this audience, that I think are pretty interesting. The first one is tablet gamers. Tablet gaming is pretty huge, but the real impressive stat around tablet gaming for me is that we have an engaged female audience. For the first time really ever in the history of gaming, we have an engaged female audience. Still not quite parity, but not far off. We also have a much older audience, much older audience, which is quite interesting. If you think about 1995 when the PlayStation 1 launched, we are now almost 20 years beyond that. So anyone who was in their 20s is now pushing into their 40s. So we have a generation who have grown up with games, and a generation who are continuing to play games, and a generation who are actually getting into games for the first time. That says something about the type of games we have as well, which again I'll come on to in a little bit. The second stat that I wanted to highlight was, if you're not familiar with Twitch TV, go and have a look. In December last year, December 2013, 45 million unique viewers in 1 month watched people playing games. If you talked about that 5-10 years ago, probably even 2 years ago, that would have been insane. Right? People would have gone, really? People are watching people playing games? 45 million of them are doing that on a regular basis. So much so that PlayStation 4 camera technology, so on a PlayStation 4 you don't have a Kinect, you have to buy a camera separately. There's a shortage of them in the world, and the shortage is purely down to Twitch integration. So Twitch, PlayStation 4 is now accounting for 20% of all videos on Twitch, because you have a share button on, if you're familiar with the device, you have a share button which automatically can upload to Twitch. The one that's not in there is of course Oculus Rift, which we'll come back onto in a little bit, which sold for $2 billion. Interesting technology. As Roger says, is it going to be one of those that's going to go into the technology orphanage with $2 billion investment from Facebook? I'm not so sure. However, my own personal view is I don't think the games is the conclusion for that piece of technology. I think it will be in other applications, some of which I can talk about in a little bit. So really in the 1980s in the Northwest, particularly in Liverpool, which was a home of technology, and then Manchester was much more on the creative side, more on the advertising side of things. In the 1980s it's when gaming really started to kick in. The companies that you may be familiar with really came about in the early 90s, particularly Psygnosis, Bizarre Creations, and then laterally Spiral House, Magenta, and a number of others. Then you had some of the big players in the industry, Sony and Activision, who came in and bought some of those companies, Sony buying Psygnosis in '94, and Bizarre Creations buying, or Activision buying into Bizarre Creations a little bit later in '97, '98. And then in terms of the industry has changed pretty dramatically over that period of time. Over those almost 20 years now since we've had PlayStation 1 coming into the marketplace, the industry has changed quite dramatically, particularly with the advent of online, mobile, and some of the new business models that have kind of kicked about. Because of that, we've had quite a lot of industry change and quite a lot of redundancies, particularly in the Northwest region. So all of those companies have had major redundancies. Bizarre Creations have shut down. Psygnosis is all but shut down. Sony still retain a plant here, but there's not a huge development in Liverpool. It tends to be outside of Liverpool. And the big change and the big problem that we've had over that period of time, over that 15, 20-year period of time, is we've lost a lot of the publishing function. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So bear in mind that the talk here is about why are we good at making and not selling, and that's one of the key reasons that we're very good at making things, but maybe not so good at selling them, and that's all to do with publishing. So in terms of the new world of self-publishing, so in the last sort of 5 years we've had the ability for very small micro businesses to be able to control their own destiny, to be able to publish their own products on a variety of platforms. The easiest sort of examples are the mobile platforms, but increasingly you're now able to publish onto console platforms, you're now able to publish onto Steam platforms, both because of an opening of the platform, but also because of proliferation of middleware that allows you to develop for multiple platforms. The big problem that a lot of developers, or certainly a lot of developers that we work with who are fairly well experienced, is a lot of them don't actually understand what publishing is. So a lot of them, previously where they made a product, they put it into a box, they wrapped it up and they gave it to a publisher, they never saw it, and then they saw a royalty that came down the line when that game sold, ideally, or not. And as we've moved into a new world of games as a service, that's completely changed now. So suddenly the mentality of fire and forget, where you make a product and you have to put it in the marketplace, forget about it and move on to the next product, is now gone. Games as a service is now hugely taken over in the world. And if you look at something like King's IPO, which happened in the last week, they really kind of went public with on the back of one big game, Candy Crush, which is 500 million users on a daily basis. And they've been running that service for a number of years already, and will continue to run that service for a long period of time. So we have a problem in traditional games companies understanding how to build products as a service as opposed to build products. Good at making, maybe not so good at the selling side of things. The other issue that we have is the antisocial nature of game development as it previously was, where, as I said, you made a game in isolation, you made it in a silo, it was your creation, your baby, you made it for 12, 24 months, and then you unleashed it to the world, and hopefully with the power of publishing, the power of marketing, it got sold to a public who were anticipating it, but you never really had to deal with them. As I say, it was a fire and forget. When you look at the new breed, and the new breed of companies, digital and social companies, they've completely turned that on their heads. Completely turned the idea of consumers on their heads. Suddenly they don't have a consumer for their products, they have a relationship, and they have friends who actually help them to make their products down the line. And we're starting to see that really kick in a lot with games now, where games are being released to the public very, very early, either in a beta test environment or in early access environment on certain platforms. And the newer developers are starting to establish relationships very early on with their audience, and actually it's trying to make that audience feel like they're part of the development process. The final point on this slide is as we moved into the self-publishing model, not only have game developers had to understand what publishing is, suddenly we started to unlock a whole lot of new business models, particularly free-to-play, and a number of different business models that are out there. And suddenly you have a game developer who has to be an economist, an analyst, a businessman, a business development person, a marketeer, all wrapped in whilst doing the main job, which is either coding, art, or a variety of different ones. So in terms of the successes and failures in the Northwest, some of you may be familiar with some of these names. If you're not, I'll rattle through them really quickly. On the left-hand side are some of the successes. We talked about Psygnosis, who sold to Sony around about 94 because they were working on a technology that was fairly similar to PlayStation. On the back of that, they launched a couple of launch titles, Wipeout, Formula 1 Destruction Derby, and had a very successful exit on the back of that. Didn't have to go into the world of self-publishing. And then you had Bizarre Creations, who sold to Activision, unfortunately got shut down subsequently, but the principals who set up the business did very well out of it. Evolution Studios, who also sold to Sony on the back of some launch titles and the creation of new IP. And then you have in the second point down there, so you have a number of companies who are kicking about at the moment, who are having, albeit limited success, but have the potential to be very successful and breakout success. Playwrights Digital, who have had about 2 million downloads of their game, which is tabletop racing on iOS and Android mobile, just about to launch on PlayStation Vita, and really starting to understand games as a service. So previously, these are game developers and the person who runs it is a game designer who has only really made box product in the past, suddenly understanding that game is now live for over a year. He's understanding how he has to continuously update that and really mind the audience. Firesprite, new company that started very recently, responsible for some of the work on the Playroom project on PlayStation 4, which is some of the very conceptual work that they're doing around PlayStation 4 and camera technology. A lot of that work done in Liverpool in conjunction with Japan. And Ripstone, who are a digital publisher and who we're an investor into. They're a digital publisher here in ex-Sony, based here in Liverpool. Unfortunately, none of the projects that they're currently publishing are from Liverpool, which is kind of interesting. I couldn't name the company, and then the last one, Martin Kenwright, a new company that's just been announced, although they've been going for almost a year. They have all the right credentials to be a pretty big success. We have a really interesting company called Catalyst who offer outsourcing expertise, particularly production expertise, based here in Liverpool. And that's something that a lot of companies are starting to look at, managed outsourcing as opposed to trying to manage it themselves. And Lucid Games, who again are a lot of ex-Bizarre Creation companies. On the failure side of things, and unfair maybe to say failure for all of them, but there are extenuating circumstances for some of them. Playbox, who have reinvented themselves as Atomicom. Bizarre Creations, we talked about Sony. SecGo, who were an analytics company who came into analytics late and came into the analytics space when analytics was becoming a bit of a commodity. Unfortunately, a little bit late to the market. And THQ Games, out in just on the outskirts of between Liverpool and Manchester in Warrington. And the real key between both of these is for the successes. The real key to the success for all of them was timing. Getting to the launch of a platform, creating original IP, making sure that IP launched in day one, and making sure that there wasn't not a huge amount of competition on the platform. And making sure that they captured a huge imagination and then being able to sequel that down the line. If you think about some of the games that they made a lot of money for the companies that invested into them. So if you look at the headline numbers of 16 million that Sony paid for Evolution Studios, for example, sounds like it's an enormous amount of money, but when you understand that the IP that they generated on the back of that with MotorStorm and other games, then it seems like a drop in the ocean. On the failure side of things, the real problem that we had on the failure side of things was the fact that they were undercapitalized. And by that I mean they just didn't have enough money. They didn't have enough money, and therefore they didn't have the ability to self-publish the way they wanted to. They didn't have enough spend in marketing. They didn't have the machine behind them. They couldn't hire the right people. They really had to nail down and make the greatest product they could, the makers, but they didn't know how to sell it. And they couldn't even invest in the selling part of it, and that was the real problem that we had there. So they had great products, great technology in some cases, just didn't know how to market it and didn't know how to get to market. There are some exceptions in there. So in terms of just a quick kind of slide on Standfast. As well as Standfast, I run a consultancy where I look at setting some strategy for games and digital companies. And the real issue for a lot of the companies that I work with, I tend to work with micro businesses, so 20 and less. The real issue for a lot of them is they really don't know how to develop the business. They know how to make great games in most cases, or they try to make great games at least. They just don't know how to develop their business. That's not how to run the business. That's not how to pay the tax man. That's not how to hire people. They just don't know how they're going to develop that business over a period of time. From Standfast's point of view, we're a production fund for games. We fund products very similar to film and TV, if you're familiar with that. We set up what's called an SPV, a special purpose vehicle offshore, which is named as the game, so GameX. And all the costs go into that, as well as all the funds go into that. But what we're looking for in games, we don't have the same problems that a publisher might have. So we don't have a portfolio of games, and we don't have gaps in our portfolio where we might need a chess game, and we might need a shoot-'em-up game, and we might need a driving game. We look at every game on its merits. The reason we invest into a game as opposed to a company is we don't want to take equity in a business. The only way for us to realize money from an equity play is if that business sells at some point down the line, and there's a high risk that that won't happen. So we invest into the product and get out of the product. We have a very simple sort of investment criteria. We look at companies that can handle budgets. The kind of budgets that we need companies to handle are £500,000 plus. So that doesn't sound like a lot of money in games, but there's not a lot of micro businesses, particularly in the UK, that can handle £500,000. And when I say handle that, understand when to draw that money down. Understand that that money links to a milestone in development. Understand that that money has to be paid back at some point. Understand the interest payments. Understand the royalties that occur over time. So really they need accountants on board. They need to have established themselves as a bit of a business. The other thing that we look for with a lot of our companies is companies that have regular other sources of income. They don't have to be games. Increasingly we're seeing companies that have sources of games companies that have sources of income outside of games, apps, technology, a whole host of different areas. The reason we want them to have regular other sources of income is they can't use our money to build their business. This is not an equity play. That's equity investment. That's somebody who's investing for the long term. We invest very short term, in and out very quickly. So they have to have a regular other sources of income, because if they don't and the game goes wrong, the company goes bust. And that's a disaster for everyone. So we don't want that to happen. We want them to have a track record. Why? Because they kind of have to know how to make a game. If they want £500,000 plus from us, they kind of know. We expect them to know how to make a game. Ideally, they have a track record in making games, but that can be in making other things. As long as they have a track record. And going back to some of the examples that I showed earlier about the companies that we think may be successful, all of them have one thing in common. They have a track record, either in making fantastic product, or in exiting businesses and making a lot of money for their investors, or a combination of both. And the last point, and the real kind of point I wanted to get across today is, as an investor into games, we have to invest into companies who want to make money. And there's nothing wrong with that in our world. There is nothing wrong with games companies coming along and saying, we would like to make money, please. That doesn't have to be millions. That doesn't even have to be hundreds of thousands. But if we're giving somebody £500,000, they need to understand that they have to make £500,000 as a minimum to get us our money back, plus the interest on top of that, and then we look for an ongoing royalty. That's before they get any money. So they need to be making significant money, and they need to understand that their game it may be their labour of love, but at the same time it has to make money. Now we help them to do that quite a lot, but that's the absolute key for us. To date, we've invested in, that's updated, 17 products we've invested in so far, £7.5 million in the UK only so far, and we're just about to launch, we're just about to invest into a product in Portugal, in Spain, and in Poland. So we're not just a UK investor. 3 of our products have launched, so we're starting to get some money back. 2 of them are on mobile, 1 of them is on Steam. The main products that we're getting at the moment tend to be on Steam. I was chatting to Gary earlier. It's where we're seeing a lot of innovation at the moment in games. It's on Steam, so we're taking quite a lot of risks on that. It's a very vibrant marketplace. It's a very interesting marketplace. It is a very, it's quite an easy market to model from our point of view. So it's quite easy for us to understand how we can make money out of that marketplace. So it is much more of a long-term play. So it's not a console massive spike of sales and then drop off completely. Steam tends to be quite steady and then very price-driven over time as people start to use sales techniques in there. We've invested into Ripstones, and that's the company in the Northwest, but we've not invested into any games in the Northwest yet. And there are some specific reasons. And the main reason is the lack of maturity in game developers in the Northwest, and that's the main reason. They just haven't been around long enough as game developers on their own. That's not to say that they haven't worked in the industry for a long time. They just haven't worked and haven't launched multiple successful products, and therefore having the ability to manage £500,000 plus projects. As I say, we look for a mixed portfolio of platforms, and we do look for a mixed business model. There is a difficulty in some of our business model. Essentially how the fund works is, if I give you £1 million, the minute you start to take money from us, we start to earn interest. So it is in the interest of the developer to pay back that money as fast as possible. When we look at some of the newer business models, particularly free-to-play, the payback period is much longer. The payback might be much higher in the end, but the payback period is much longer. So therefore the interest that you start to pay really starts to ratchet up over a period of time. So the other issue that we have with free-to-play is actually in most of the most of the funding goes on marketing as opposed to on the game development. So most of the funding comes post-development. How do we get awareness? How do we drive installs? How do we get people to buy into the product? Et cetera, et cetera. For us, and generally, one of the problems that we see with a lot of developers we see is the ability to scale. Do our developers understand how they might scale a business? And do they understand how to scale that specific product? So if a company comes to us and says, I think I'm going to do 500,000 downloads of this game, it's going to be a huge success, and we say, yeah, we'll bet on that. That sounds like a reasonable idea for us. Do they understand how to scale that if 5 million people buy into that game? Do they understand how to run the back-end services? Do they understand how to run that consumer support and so on as they go along? Can they manage the money? Do they understand publishing, and do they have some experience of that? Are they ambitious enough? So, having worked across in the US quite a bit, the ambition levels are much higher than they are in the UK and Europe generally. And by that I mean, they don't talk in hundreds of thousands, they talk in millions straight away. So they don't look for investment of £500,000, they push it and look for millions because they know that they can scale. They know that they understand publishing. They know that they have the ambition to push through that level. And a lot of the times we're constrained a little bit here by lack of ambition or maybe lack of understanding that it's available to people. So when we go and talk to developers and say to them, actually, that's an interesting game, have you got any others? And they go, yeah, I've got another 3 here in the drawer. For us, that's great. 'Cause for what that means is make all 4 of them. As long as it's within the limits, make all 4 of those games, because we know that out of those 4 games, 2 of those will make money, 2 of them might lose money, but you know what, for us it's a bit of a risk, it lessens the risk. Developers go, well, I never knew I would be able to make 4 games at once, that's a real challenge. But it goes back to the question of, if I'm going to give you the money to make 4 games, you thought you were going to make 1, can you scale up your team pretty quickly to have all the people on board pretty quickly to do that? Do you understand how to manage that team? Do you understand how to manage the money? Do you understand how to pay that team on a regular basis? Do you understand recruitment? Do you understand the HR, et cetera, as you go along? Flexibility, something else that you see a lot in the US and not so much here in the UK, the ability to, the word that they use is pivot, the ability to move from a project or from a technology to another technology, particularly in games, platform to platform, technology to technology, middleware to middleware. Can you do that, and can you do that comfortably, easily? Do you have the technical nous to be able to do that very, very quickly? And the final bit is, do you understand how we're going to make money? So do you understand how an investor makes money? So a lot of people are scared of investment, a lot of people are scared of investors, a lot of people think, because of TV programs and like, that investors are scary people and they never want to part with their money. It's the absolute opposite. The only way that we make money is to give other people money and they make money on our behalf. That's the only way an investor makes money. That's the only way you can make money in this, in the investment game. So can you understand that, and can you create an exit opportunity if it's an equity play, or can you make sure that you make money for your investor? And if you understand that, suddenly you have an investor that's a partner of yours. If you don't understand that, you're going to have an investor who's going to fight with you all the way. And if that's an equity investor, they're going to try and sell the business from you. And if it's a production investor, it's an absolute nightmare, because we would sit there then and have to sit with an IP that's half created, that doesn't, that's of no value to us and of no value to the developer. So the developer needs to understand a little bit about how to create value, how to create return on investment. So having said all that, so let's explore whether games can be, that's very commercial, and it was very, very different to some of the talks you talked this morning. But can games be commercial and meaningful? Yes, is the answer to that. Yes, I believe they can. But I think the starting point has got to be, somebody has to understand how it's paid for. How do you make money? That's the absolute key. That can be commission, that can be a whole host of different ways. But somebody needs to make money. That's the absolute key here. Nobody is going to go around and go, here's £1 million, 10 million, £5 million, just go ahead and do whatever you like. There has to be some payback somewhere down the line. Sometimes that payback might not just be in money, that payback might be from a government who wants to invest in a specific area for engagement or for whatever areas they're interested in. So I've only touched on them: playful design, gamification, serious games, very interesting areas, very interesting, not hugely commercial. That's the real issue at the moment, is there are very few people making money in that space just yet. I think that's going to happen. Commissioning doesn't really work, unfortunately, I don't think, in our opinion. And by that I mean publisher commissioning, TV commissioning, and the real issue for us is from a commissioning point of view, it tends to just end up as a work-for-hire development. And what tends to end up with developers who do a work-for-hire job is they run out of steam very quickly, and that's interest mainly, because there's no long-term gain in it for the developer. So it's a straightforward, here's X amount of pounds to make that game. When you finish that game, you're gone. You might get a second commission or a third commission, but that's it, it's work for hire. And by the way, you don't own that game afterwards, we'll just take it and we'll do whatever we want with it. There's no, again, a horrible term that a lot of Americans use, but there's no skin in the game, is what a lot of people say. The developer doesn't have any long-term interest in that. So what happens when they're 3/4 of the way through that project? They start looking around for other projects. And anyone who's made games knows that that final quarter of making the game is the absolute key. That's when the game gets really, that's when the game becomes either fantastic or average. And that's the big kind of issue for it. The other problem that we have with a lot of the a lot of game development happening outside of games is a lot of games companies get into that without understanding what that sales cycle is. I think we had a chat about the education sales cycle there earlier, Roger. And a lot of the other sectors don't understand the nature of game development, so therefore they don't understand the development cycle of developers. So we've got to understand what the sales cycle is. It's very different to sell a game into the education sector or sell gaming technology into the manufacturing sector or military and so on, as it is to sell it to Joe Public. We kind of understand that. Yes, the business models are changing. Yes, you have to understand a bit about publishing, but actually it's still kind of, I make a game, I make people aware of the game, if that's what they want, great, and then we'll sell it to that audience. Do we understand how the automobile sector works? Do we understand how some of those other sectors work? So final couple of slides is very clear. So what's the focus and the future for the Northwest? My view is that a region like the Northwest, which in the global scheme of things in games is quite small, is we're a generalist right now. And being a generalist, you can never rise to the top. There are people who are better funded, there are people who are more clever, there are people who have got more people in their studios, etc. So how do we get a focus? I believe that getting a narrow focus and understanding the entire value chain and the needs of that chain and really where you can make a difference. So understanding, and when I say the entire value chain, that isn't just development, publishing, that's right the way through, education, right the way through from primary to HEI education, right the way through to all of the ancillary services that a game developer might need in terms of cloud, in terms of rendering, in terms of publishing, finance, legals, etc. Some interesting things happening in the Northwest. There's an mHealth initiative happening in Liverpool at the moment, mobile health, which looks like it might have some legs. They're trying to create a mobile health platform that other developers can therefore develop for, which I think is quite an interesting space. Some interesting things happening in e-learning. Some interesting things happening in science. I'm governor of, I see another governor down here, of Studio School, which is an academy school in Liverpool, which is based around video games. So it takes 14, 16-year-olds and educates them about making video games. It has 3 main subject areas, one around coding, one around art and design, and the other around entrepreneurship and business and that side of things. The really interesting thing for me, apart from the fact that I think it's great, and I think it's a phenomenal opportunity for kids to understand a bit more about games in a structured environment, and also phenomenal for a lot of local companies to get some talent, but they are sitting next to a life sciences school. So suddenly you have the opportunity of mixing games and life science, which is a really interesting space. In the UK, we have one of the biggest funds available in the UK. It's called the Wellcome Trust, and they're heavily investing into gaming technology to improve the understanding and the use of science. So some really interesting areas there. And I really believe that the city and the region generally is just too small to try and compete at everything. And trying to do that will just lead to general average. And the other problem that we have, having worked with the local council here, is it's very difficult to market Liverpool and the wider region as a games hub because there's so much generalism going on. So finding the niche, I think, is the real key. And I think that's, for me, that's the area that that we should be trying to get some government or certainly local government support on. Very quickly, a lot of these, I'll very quickly rattle through a few of these. So you asked me to talk very quickly about what I thought the future of gaming was. So, and I'll talk to certain number of points. So console evolution, what's going to happen with some of the consoles? You know, are we going to at last see what they term these true multimedia systems? Sony tried it last year with PlayStation 3, disaster, because gamers didn't want it, you know, didn't really care about the fact that it was a Blu-ray player and the fact that it did streaming and the fact that it had a media server and blah, blah, blah. Although a lot of people now subsequently have started to use it as those devices. Microsoft are betting very heavily that Xbox One will be a true multimedia system and be the only system under the TV. So interesting to see where they go. We've just obviously had the crazy news about Oculus Rift and how that's going to evolve. It'd be interesting to see what Facebook do with it. But at the same time, Sony have come out with their system called Morpheus. And some of the advanced technology that some of the games companies we deal with are using Kinect for is pretty exciting, pretty interesting. Very interesting to see what they do. 2 years ago, consoles were dead. Everybody in the world says consoles are dead, never going to happen. And suddenly consoles are alive again and everybody wants to make games for consoles. So it's a very cyclical thing. It'll be very interesting to see what kind of innovation. VR will clearly be one of those. I think, personally, I think there's a lot of work to be done around ambient room technology, about putting you into a room environment as opposed to a VR headset. And I think that has a lot of applications outside of gaming, particularly in schools. So, you know, creating environments for learning and so on. Wearable computing is quite interesting. The glasses and the watches and stuff like that. The one that I'm making a bet on is Facebook clothing. I think we'll see some social media clothing in the next couple of years. I think that's bound to happen. I think as people start to, and I think it has a dual purpose. I think as a parent, it's quite an interesting area. It allows me to keep track of kids without actually keeping track of them. I think it's quite an interesting space in terms of the ability to post to social media without actually having to do anything. So your clothing talking to a server somewhere and talking to the cloud. It's quite an interesting space. So I can see that happening very, very quickly once they figured out the real issue around that heat dispersion and around clothing and stuff like that. Apps for Life, I came across a project in 2010 in Japan where they were talking about robotic nurses and stuff like that. Very interesting, very, very interesting space around health and robotics. And some of the things that they're doing in car is quite interesting as well. Although there's a real problem around matching production scheduling on games and car technology. And it's all to do with the length of the production process. But pretty interesting sort of stuff. Some of the storytelling stuff is quite interesting. Although I don't think they've pushed it far enough for me. I think there could be a link to literacy. I think there could be a real opportunity to use gaming to push literacy in schools, particularly with boys, where in the UK we have a massive problem with boys and literacy right now. They're just not reading, they're not interested, they're not engaging enough, and we know that those are all the things that games can do for them. And then one of the other areas, going back to the Twitch stats, in esports, I think esports is quite interesting. I think over the next couple of years you'll start to see that become much more prevalent. We actually have in Liverpool one of the top 5 FIFA players in the world. He's been kicked off every EA server because he started to bet on himself, and of course that's not really something that EA want, but you only start to unlock these things over a period of time. So esports, I think, is going to become huge. For those of you who are not familiar with esports, you know, people are watching this stuff in millions, absolute millions. 65, I think the last football, Pro Evolution Soccer, they had 65,000 people went to the Parc des Princes, which is in Paris, and watched 2 people sitting in the middle of the pitch playing on a PlayStation, playing against each other. 65,000 people playing on a game, you know, and that's live, apart from the people who are watching it online at the same time. So quite an interesting space. Cross-platform, which from a games point of view, everybody's talked about for years. Cross-platform is fantastic, and Unity now can go cross-platform, which is a middleware piece of software. But true cross-platform, I think, is about to come. I think the cross-platform across sectors can be quite interesting. So can we create middleware that allows you to make a game for a platform that's a gaming platform, but also for a manufacturing platform, or for a transport platform, or for an education platform? Pretty interesting. And lots of kind of examples of that happening at the moment around tools. And cross-genre, As I said at the end, it has to be commercial and has to mean something from a cross-genre point of view. And I think my last point is, do we think in a number of years, and I'll leave you with this sort of thought, that we may have a game of life? So think about the game of life, which is a board game. And you think about what happens in that. You get points, you progress, you move on in that game. And you think about some of the things that already happen in our life. If you take the health option, you might not smoke, you might reduce your insurance premiums. Well, that already happens. If you take the safe option driving, you might reduce your insurance premiums. That already happens in our life. If you take the pension option and retire early, that already happens in our life. If you decide to go for a career option and go to university, you can earn more money. Again, that already happens in our life. And if you take the unhealthy option, you might die young. So we already do a lot of this in our life. Gaming has become integral in our life. We're only starting to unlock it now. We're only starting to think about it as gaming. Previously, we didn't think about this sort of stuff as gaming. But now that gaming is ingrained in everybody's lives, we're starting to really explore some of these. That's all I've got. Yeah. Thank you.